And I'll move to the matter of public importance. I've received a letter from the honourable member for Hotham proposing that a definite matter of public importance be submitted to the House for discussion, namely the government's failure to implement the recommendations of the Banking Royal Commission after voting against it 26 times. I call upon those honourable members who approve of the proposed discussion to rise in their places, and I call the member for Hotham.
Well, thank you very much, Speaker, and it's a great privilege to speak for the opposition on this matter of public importance this afternoon. And it's good to have that opportunity, Speaker, because it allows me to respond to what I found to be some wacky and bizarre rewritings of history that we heard from the Prime Minister and the Treasurer opposite me during question time. I mean, is the Prime Minister actually expecting Australians to thank him now for calling a Royal Commission? This is a Royal Commission that he voted against 26 times. What we know from media reports is that the Prime Minister he was the last bastion protecting the big banks in Cabinet against calling a Royal Commission. He spent the last years of his life as Treasurer of this country trying hand over fist to give the big banks a $17 billion tax cut, and now he's constructed a parliamentary sitting calendar that means that we've got Royal Commission recommendations that we can't really do anything about for 8 months, Deputy Speaker. And here we are in question time, and we've got senior members of the Liberal Party who did everything in their power to protect the big banks, telling us that now they deserve a golf clap because they were the ones that called a Royal Commission. That's after, Deputy Speaker. You'll remember that the banks asked the government to call a Royal Commission. Now, Deputy Speaker, there is a great deal more to say about the politics of this issue, but I actually want to open my remarks today by spending a couple of minutes talking about a group of people who have not actually got a lot of airtime in this discussion about how to make banking more fair in Australia, and that is the victims of bank misconduct. Deputy Speaker, without these victims, there would never have been a Royal Commission in this country, and we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to people who were wronged terribly by the banks, to whistleblowers who observed appalling conduct within the banks and had that bravery to come forward. Some of these victims, Deputy Speaker, have had to go through terrible emotional turmoil as they've had to relive some of the most difficult times of their lives. We're talking about emotional turmoil, financial distress and sometimes family breakdown, even mental illnesses that have plagued them for the rest of their lives, Deputy Speaker. So I believe Australia owes a great debt of gratitude to those people. 10,000 of them made submissions to the Royal Commission. They did so with great passion. I think, Deputy Speaker, we actually have a group of bank victims who are here with us today. There they are in the gallery. It would be great for members of parliament to acknowledge those people there. Many of them have been fighting the big banks on disputes that have gone literally for decades. And for some of the people who are up in the gallery right now, even though they were wronged by the banks have taken them to court and ended up just bleeding them dry while they've sat through litigation after litigation. And, Deputy Speaker, I have to say that we need to do a little bit more to hold these banks to account for the things that they've done. So I want to particularly thank Michael, Selwyn, Craig, Bill, Rita, Caroline and Tony and the others who are gathered in the chamber today for their ongoing advocacy on behalf of all victims of bank misconduct. If I can just say one thing more about this group that's gathered here, Deputy Speaker. They represent a very active community of people right around the country who have been pushing for a long time for bank reform. One of the things I'm really struck by when I sit down with these victims is that they often acknowledge that it's not possible to rewrite history and to go back to the beginning of their case and to fix all of the bad things that happened to them. Their concern is about the future and thinking about other people who might need help too. Every time we have a bank victim roundtable, people talk to me about other people who've got it worse than them, and I'm just really touched by the attitude that they have. Deputy Speaker, it's stories like Raina's story that really drove home to me how important it is that we tackle misconduct and reform our culture in bank. And I want to tell you about this gentleman who lives in my hometown of Melbourne. This is a fellow whose wife was diagnosed with cancer just after the birth of their second child. He went through hell, genuine hell, Deputy Speaker, dealing with the Commonwealth Bank due to inadequate hardship policies. It included, Deputy Speaker, having to go back to work during the last months of his wife's life when there was no financial benefit in that for the bank, but that was what he was forced to do. It included, Deputy Speaker, the bank continuously calling his dying wife to talk to her about debts that she supposedly owed the bank. Other victims I'm met with, like Paul and Liz Furno and Julia Mandarano, have lost everything in their disputes with the banks. Some of them have lost homes. They still feel the physical and mental impacts of what have happened. So, Deputy Speaker, I do want to pay tribute to those victims and say that we haven't forgotten about them, and there is more that needs to be done to assist them and their cases. And we are just so genuinely committed to this task of making sure that we do have a fairer banking situation in this country. Deputy Speaker, that was a big impetus for why Labor fought so long and so hard for a Royal Commission. And, Deputy Speaker, you would have seen that for almost 600 days we pushed in this chamber for those on the other side of the chamber to see what we saw, and that is that we had a banking system that was treating some Australians appallingly. They were doing it in a way that was sometimes breaking the law, and there seemed to be, Deputy Speaker, no accountability. But what we saw on the other side of the chamber, Deputy Speaker, was incredibly disappointing, and it continues to disappoint me today. As a politician, I don't like to dwell on the past, and I don't like to stand in this chamber and point the finger and yell at the other side about all the things that they've done wrong. But it does bother me, and it does make me worry, Deputy Speaker, about the willingness of those on the other side of the chamber to actually have the grit to do what is in the Royal Commission recommendations. I just don't trust them to do it. That's the genuine truth, Deputy Speaker. They have a terrible record when it comes to cracking down on bank misconduct. When Labor was in government, Deputy Speaker, you might know that we introduced the Future of Financial Advice reforms. And indeed, Deputy Speaker, the Royal Commission went to some lengths to talk about how incredibly important those laws, those Labor reforms were. Deputy Speaker, the centrepiece of the Future of Financial Advice reforms was the introduction of a best interest test for financial advisors. So what the parliament was saying for the first time was that financial advisors have to act in the best interests of their clients. Well, it sounds pretty obvious now, doesn't it, Deputy Speaker? But what we found is that those on the other side didn't want it. They didn't want it when it first was introduced by Labor, and when they first came to government, they tried to get rid of the best interest test, Deputy Speaker. Now, how is it that they can possibly be plausibly trusted to implement the Royal Commission recommendations when that's their track record? But of course, that's just the very beginning of their fight to protect the big banks and other people in the financial services industry, Deputy Speaker. This government, the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government, didn't support the reforms. They fought all the way to stop them being implemented. Now, Deputy Speaker, Labor came out quite a long time ago, in April 2016, saying that we thought it was time to have a Royal Commission into our banking sector. And what did we see from the other side? We saw a Prime Minister and his Liberals huffing and puffing, and frankly embarrassing themselves in a rush to declare what a bad idea this was. We had the Prime Minister call this a populist whinge and a reckless distraction. And, Deputy Speaker, it is very important that we in this chamber and the Australian people never forget those words, because the truth is that even though, after 26 times of voting against a Royal Commission, they were finally pushed into calling one, their attitude tells us everything we need to know about the willingness of the people opposite us to hold the banks to account. Every day that the government delayed, more Australians were being charged fees for no service, more Australians were being sold useless junk insurance, and more Australians were being ripped off by the banks. And that whole time, that whole 600 days that we were calling for a Royal Commission and all of those Australians were being ripped off by financial service providers, what was the government doing? They were using every political opportunity they had to argue to give the banks a $17 billion tax cut. That is the taxes that everyone at home watching pays. The taxes that I pay was going to be taken and given to the big banks as a tax cut. That was their response to all the community outrage about what the big banks were doing. And now we're being called into this chamber and lectured from the other side about things to do with the Banking Royal Commission. Well, it just beggars belief, Deputy Speaker, and we just can't trust them on it. Now, Deputy Speaker, I want to just cover over a quick couple of matters, because I've focused quite a bit on what happened before the Royal Commission reported, and now we have a Royal Commission report. Well, the smart thing for a political party to do is to say, yes, we're really in this fight and we are going to accept the recommendations and we're going to move forward. But what we've had from the government is the exact opposite. We've had them use every little sneaky trick there is, even just straight out of the block, to say, oh, we're not going to do this, we're going to do it a little bit differently, we're going to do it this way and that way. Well, Deputy Speaker, it just shows again that they can't be trusted. And just with my remaining few seconds, Deputy Speaker, I just want to mention one more thing, and that is the part-time parliament. Now, we have the opportunity to implement a lot of the recommendations in this report. Of course, not all of them, because some of them do require a lengthy consultation process and some sober thinking time, but some of them are just completely straightforward, Deputy Speaker. In fact, the government claims that we can't implement any of them, and then in the same breath tells us that they are implementing some of them in the Senate. It is intellectually incoherent. It's completely ridiculous. So, Deputy Speaker, what we say to those on the other side is, if you really think that we should believe that you've changed your mind, call an extra fortnight of sittings of this parliament so we can come here, do our jobs and pass some necessary reforms so those bank victims who are sitting up in the gallery aren't back here in another few years' time complaining that nothing much has changed.
I call the Assistant Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I acknowledge the banking victims in the gallery? My early life was defined by being a victim of one of the big fours when my family in the very early 80s was encouraged to borrow overseas in unhedged Swiss francs. And of course, when the spread increased, our family lost everything. We would end up settling with the bank, literally on the top stair of the courthouse. Wacker Williams, my colleague in the Senate, bankrupted by the same thing. So your pain is well felt. My young life was defined by this. So as a government, we are not blind to what you've been through. I am not blind to what you've been through. The conduct of the financial institutions that should have known better was deplorable. They have let Australians down for decades. Go have a beer with Wacker Williams in the Senate to get his view of some of the conduct of banks. I mean, Wacker and I have spent the last 10 years since the post-GFC banking inquiries working with the then Labor government of the day, looking at reforms to this. In fact, the parliamentary inquiry into financial services, I think, had 11 recommendations, of which we on the committee agreed with the government of the day, the Ripoll inquiry, because it was that important. So my message to you from the Assistant Treasurer is we hear your pain, we understand it, and we are committed to doing something about it. And yes, there are politics of the day, and I understand that, but please, from me, don't underestimate our sense of compassion and what we want to do to try and help you. It was a bruising Royal Commission. 68 days, 130 witnesses. I gather many of you were witnesses. Many of you were not able to be witnesses. But Hayne has given his assurance, and I think he's a fair man of integrity, that everyone's story was read and heard and listened to. And the report is comprehensive. It's a forensic inquiry into our financial system. The opposition has made it clear through the Shadow Minister opposite that Labor will implement all 76 recommendations, and the government has made it clear that we will act on all 76 recommendations. There is no question you heard, and there's no question the government of the day, this government, will act, and we are seeking to act as quickly as possible. But it's important to also understand that we have acted. We haven't sat by as the Commission unfolded. We recognised many of the faults that needed to be fixed. I was quite visceral on many of the faults that I wanted fixed. So we've been acting. And some of the things this government has done are impressive. They would have helped me out. And it's important, I think, we understand some of the key things that we have done as a government, because we haven't been flat-footed. This is not a government that doesn't care. And I understand the politics of trying to frame us like that, but nothing could be further from the truth. Go spend some time with Wacker Williams. Speak to a senator sold up by a bank, bankrupted and tossed from his land, and you'll hear the heartbeat of a bloke that does care, as do I as does the Human Services Minister next to me, who oversees Centrelink and sees the pain of hundreds of thousands of Australians that use those services and move through it. It's why we moved to AFCA, the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. It's why we've been working with Helen Coonan, the Chair, for a scheme of last resort, and we've been working through it for months with Helen prior to the Royal Commission announcing. We're looking to better protect consumers. We've already banned excessive credit card surcharges. We've simplified calculation of credit card interest. We've banned unsolicited offers on credit card limit increases. We've established the Banking Executive Accountability Regime, which is a serious regime for banking executives, so they can't say to my family, to yours, that borrowing overseas is secure when it's unhedged, or that they would sell you a product with guarantees that didn't exist. That if those things happen, there are penalties that involve jail time for executives. We've established the Financial Advisor Standards and Ethics Authority. We've appointed second Deputy Commissioners to ASIC and APRA. We've required administrators of significant financial benchmarks, including the bank bill swap rate, to be licensed. We've made manipulations of any financial benchmarks a criminal and civil offence. We've increased APRA's powers over non-bank lenders, increased APRA's powers in the event of crisis. We've introduced industry funding for ASIC. We've removed ASIC employees in the Public Service Act so they can employ and get the best possible people they need. We're in the process now of enhancing ASIC's ability to ban individuals, strengthening their ability to refuse and cancel licences. We're boosting criminal and civil penalties for misconduct, in some cases by 10 times, 1,000%. We're strengthening whistleblower protections, and this week we'll be introducing from the Senate the whistleblower regime, literally a world first in this space, and I'll be bringing forward on Thursday a raft of legislation and director identification number, combining 35 registers of business information into one to get greater transparency in this issue of who are directors, what are they doing and where are they going. We've strengthened regulation of super funds, and there's more to do in the Senate. We're lifting governance standards for super funds. We're seeking to reunite people with their lost super accounts, and there's a lot of lost super. I'm talking billions and billions and billions of lost super that needs to be reunited with people. We're banning exit fees on super accounts, capping fees on low balance superannuation accounts, extending unfair contract term protections for insurance. We're removing restrictions on choice of super funds, improving explanations of insurance products, imposing design and distribution obligations on financial products so that products cannot be sold to individuals like you and I that are not appropriate for us. To stop that poor advice, we're empowering ASIC to modify or ban harmful financial products. These are things we've already been doing. There's nothing new here. I haven't even got to us acting yet on the 76 recommendations from the Royal Commission. This is everything we've been doing to sort out some of this financial mess because we care and we get it. We do. It's important to us. In terms of the action we're now taking on those 76 recommendations, they are substantial. In terms of the scheme of last resort with AFCA, we'll go back 10 years, consistent with the period examined by the Royal Commission. We're compensating those individuals who had prior unpaid determinations in their favour by the predecessor bodies of AFCA, which will see almost 300 consumers finally receive compensation totalling around $30 million as a consequence of prior misconduct. We'll extend the jurisdiction of the Federal Court to cover corporate criminal misconduct, which will expedite cases that are considered by state courts and commonly take over 2 years to actually be heard. We're commencing a capability review of APRA to be led by Graham Samuel AC and conducting further capability reviews every 4 years. So Commissioner Haynes' recommendations and the government's response advance consumers, we think, in 4 key ways. It'll strengthen and expand protections for consumers, small business, rural and remote communities. We'll raise accountability and governance standards that are fundamental to ensure we as consumers get the advice we need. will enhance the effectiveness of regulators and provide for remedies for those harmed by misconduct. The government gets it. We've heard the voices of those being affected. We have sought to act over the last few years in terms of progressively working to ensure a far better financial system. Do not be disavowed that this government does not hear you. It does. We get it. We get it personally, we get it collectively, and as a government we always have.
I call the member for Fenner.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Last December I was contacted by the parents of a young man in my electorate who was given a $40,000 loan by one of the big four banks. At the time, he was sleeping in his car. He had precarious employment. According to his parents, his understanding of finance and law was minimal. He now finds himself hounded by a debt agency for that $40,000. The Royal Commission has revealed rorts and rip-offs and rigging. Insurance sold to a man with Down syndrome. Indigenous Australians targeted for products they didn't need. Fees for no service. And dozens of criminal referrals. But this was the report that the Liberals never wanted us to see. Asked whether he'd call a Royal Commission, the Prime Minister described it as hollow, populist nonsense. He said it would be a QC's complaints desk, a populist whinge, a reckless distraction. He said instead, quote, "We have a tough cop on the beat in that area. It is called ASIC. We have a strong regulator. It's called APRA." Well, what did the Royal Commission make of arguments like that? The Prime Minister said the banking sector is incredibly strong, another observation sadly at odds with the conclusions of Commissioner Hayne. And it's no surprise that the Liberals fought so hard against the Royal Commission, given their track record, given their history. This is the party of Garfield Barwick. It is the party of the bottom of the harbour schemes. The Liberals are the party that voted against Labor's Future of Financial Advice reforms in 2012, with Prime Minister Morrison calling them corner-cutting and heavy-handed regulation. That, he said, would tie business and consumers up in red tape. This is the party that in 2014 tried to water down the Future of Financial Advice reforms by removing the duty of financial advisers to act in the best interest of their client. They wanted to remove the opt-in requirement. They wanted to allow conflicted remuneration. And you just have to look at their background. The member for Higgins, Senator Hume, Senator Senadinos, worked for the National Australia Bank before coming here. The Treasurer worked for Deutsche Bank. And in New South Wales, they've just pre-selected for the Senate Andrew Bragg, a former Commonwealth Bank staffer. It is no coincidence that the members for Goldstein, Fadden and Moore are currently embroiled in fundraising scandals involving finance. It is no wonder that Kenneth Hayne couldn't crack a smile for the cameras when handing the report to the Treasurer. Previously, we thought the Treasurer's most awkward moment came when he held a press conference with Jay Weatherill, but I think this one went just one better. As Bernard Keane wrote in Crikey, for most of the last decade, the relations between the Liberals and financial services sector have been beyond the ordinary relationship with business, which understandably favour more business-line parties and politicians. The ties of money, personnel and aligned interest are deep and rich. And you see now, with the Liberals failing to implement the Hayne report in full. Labor, by contrast, will implement the Hayne report in full. We will do so because we have a strong track record of reform. In the teeth of a global financial crisis, over the objections of the Liberals, we banned mortgage exit fees. We encouraged competition in the banking market. In 2016, we announced our commitment to amend the Corporations Act to encourage better access to finance for member-owned firms. In 2017, the Coalition said that they would follow suit, but they've done nothing. I come back again to the victims of banking scandals in Australia. Victims like David Harris, who had the Commonwealth Bank feed his gambling addiction, despite the fact that he said, "I explained I'm clearly a gambler. I have a gambling problem. I can't understand why they kept offering me more money." Scandals like NAB staff accepting cash-stuffed envelopes in bribes. Scandals such as the woman who, Nalini Thurumendam, who sold her jewellery to pay a lemon loan. Scandals like dole recipients who are flogged junk insurance. Deputy Speaker, you can't trust the Liberals. They never wanted the future of financial advice reforms, they never wanted the Royal Commission, and they will always fight against anything that disturbs their cosy relationships with the finance sector in Australia.
I call the member for Lyne.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Banking Royal Commission has exposed a lot of very poor and bad behaviour. There is no argument about that, but I just want to correct the record. I can't remember any subsequent 26 votes in this House blocking a Royal Commission. You know why, Mr Deputy Speaker? Because only executive government can create a Royal Commission. Who we should be thanking is the Senator for Queensland, Barry O'Sullivan, Senator for New South Wales, Wacker Williams, member for Wide Bay, Lou O'Brien, and the member for Dawson, George Christensen, who actually put together a bill to put before the House for a commissioning of inquiry, which is a legal possibility through the House of Representatives. Now, former Prime Minister, current Prime Minister, former Minister for Finance and Revenue have all admitted that they wish they'd done something sooner. We have been arguing for this for a very long time, but as the member for Fadden outlined, we have already taken substantial actions. We have created the Banking Executive Accountability Regime. We have got the Australian Financial Complaints Authority and a whole host of other manoeuvres that the member for Fadden just outlined on credit cards, on superannuation, on so many areas of financial services that needed correction and betterment. The banking system seemed to be working fine for banks, but in so many instances it certainly wasn't working well for customers. Friends, family friends and professional acquaintances that I've personally spent a lot of time in my life with have come out the bad end of bad advice from financial institutions, including banks. Whether it was Swiss loans, it was outlined by member for Fadden, or having their farm sold up once there was any hint of risk, only to have the farm or the asset sold in a fire sale, and people involved in that advice being ultimate purchasers of it. So we have done so much already. And where was the other side? They're not immune. Subsequent governments have glossed over financial mismanagement and bad behaviour. Where was the other side when Opie's Prime happened, when the Storm financial crisis? They let that skirt through. Where was the member for Maribyrnong then? Where was the member for Lily? They were in exactly similar situations and they did nothing. But what we have done is we've received the recommendations from Commissioner Hayne. The Treasurer has put out government response within a weekend. We are still waiting for a response from the opposition. They say in principle, but that is a very vague term, Mr Deputy Speaker. We want to know specifics of what they are going to do. Now, first of all, we are improving consumer outcomes. We're putting in place a best interest duty. We're banning trailing commissions and volume-based bonuses. The Treasurer's already said that in his speech. We're reviewing, after 3 years, the implications of getting rid of trailing commissions, because what we don't want to do is get rid of the broking industry and have everyone relying solely on the banks for their advice about loans. As I mentioned, the Banking Executive Accountability Regime is being extended to the insurance industry and superannuation. ASIC should have joint responsibility with APRA in this space, and they will be the main regulatory oversighter. APRA and ASIC will have a separate board oversighting that they're actually doing their job. Trustees and directors of superannuation funds will be subject to civil penalties for breaches of their duties. New system of discipline for financial advisors, with stronger industry reference checking, greater reporting and serious compliance concerns will go to ASIC. A new disciplinary body to which all advisors must be registered. We have given extra funds, $170 million, to ASIC and APRA, and we have appointed new commissioners and deputy commissioners. ASIC,
I thank the member for lying. His time has expired, and I call the member for Herbert.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Those in the Morrison government should really be ashamed of their lack of action in terms of assisting people who have been victims of very poor practice from banks. This government has clearly put the interests of banks ahead of the victims and working Australians. Just like everyone else in Labor and across the country, I am sick and tired of having to drag LNP members to do what is right when it comes to the banks. I was disgusted that Prime Minister Scott Morrison and the LNP members voted 26 times against the Banking Royal Commission. Has the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, or Treasurer Josh Frydenberg apologised to the Australian public for voting against a Banking Royal Commission? No, but clearly they should. I was disgusted when the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and the LNP members voted to give the big banks a $17 billion tax handout whilst the Banking Royal Commission was underway. I was sick and tired of having to fight the LNP Morrison government to extend the Royal Banking Commission so as to allow the Commission to travel to regional Queensland. But the Morrison government ignored those calls and ignored regional Queenslanders. I was absolutely shocked when I was first elected at the number of people who came into my office with boxes full of paperwork demonstrating how they had been victimised and had lost everything. I was sick and tired of having to fight for the Banking Royal Commission report to be released, but finally it has been after all the rigmarole. After the constant dragging Prime Minister Scott Morrison and the LNP to the table to do just what was right by the Australian people instead of their big profit best friend bankers, we finally got the report. You would think that the Australian workers, the Australian families and importantly victims of the banks could rest easy because finally something could be done. But no. Instead now, Labor, the Australian workers, families and victims have to go through another fight with this government. We have to fight for the recommendations of the Banking Royal Commission to be legislated. I am shocked and outraged. I am disgusted that those opposite are putting their banking friends ahead of the Australian public. The Morrison government has confirmed that they have no intention of legislating recommendations before the election. Let me tell LNP members across how things work in the real world. If you were an ordinary worker and you decided to only show up for 2 weeks in 4 months, you would be sacked. So why do the LNP think that it's okay in this place to show up for 2 weeks in 4 months in 2019? Why does Prime Minister Morrison get to show up for only 2 weeks out of 4 months to do what he is paid by taxpayers to do, that is, govern? If a doctor received an important report that could prevent a disease from spreading, that doctor would be at work immediately, that very same day, reading the report, taking action to help their patients and to prevent the spread of the disease. But instead, we have an LNP government who don't want to hold their banking mates to account, who will not even put forward a piece of legislation to help out the victims of the banks. They would rather delay any action and delay any redress for the victims. The Royal Commission's damning report revealed a culture of greed in Australia's banks that led to shocking mistreatment of customers. It revealed unconscionable, corrupt and potentially criminal behaviour in the banking and finance service sector. As Commissioner Haynes said in his final report, the financial services industry is too important to the economy of the nation to allow what has happened in the past to continue or to happen again. But the Morrison government is allowing this greed to continue and the potential victim list to grow by refusing to put forward legislation that supports all recommendations in the Banking Royal Commission report. The Morrison government has failed to accept the recommendations of the Royal Commission, using weasel words to back out of at least 14 recommendations. And I know the longer this government takes to act on the findings, the longer the list will get of the findings they will back away from. Not only is the government not accepting the entire findings of the Commission report, the Morrison government is even voting in favour of banks regarding Labor's amendments to protect Australians. Just recently, the LNP members voted against Labor's amendments that would have seen greater penalties and longer jail sentences for dodgy bank executives. Even when Labor is trying to help victims, those opposite work for the banks and not the Australian people. My message to the Prime Minister and the LNP members is really quite simple. If you can't even be bothered to show up for work and to act in the best interests of Australian people, then call an election and call it now, and allow the Labor Party, a party for the people, to govern this great country.
Time has expired, and I call the member for Forward.
Well, thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And as somebody who spent a long time in the banking and financial services sector before coming into this place, I have to say that the revelations of the Royal Commission were very disappointing and disheartening. To see that the profession of banking had stooped to the levels that it did was indeed a disappointment, and I hope that out of this Royal Commission, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the banking industry takes a good hard look at the decisions it's made and the things that it has done to ensure that what we've seen illuminated through the Royal Commission process is not repeated. As I reflect, Mr Deputy Speaker, on the many former colleagues who are no longer in the banking industry and the discussions that I've had with some of those, we all agree on one thing, that the notion of banking built on relationships with customers that we started with in the bank in the early 80s is to all intents and purposes today dead. And I think we see a banking sector that sadly is no longer run by professional bankers who have an interest in their customers' welfare and the longevity of those relationships. Where we see a banking industry populated by managers with professional degrees and educational experience who have never ever worked on the shop floor in the branch. The days of a branch manager being able to meet with their clients and discuss their needs and come up with an appropriate solution for their circumstances and work with them through difficult times doesn't appear to exist anymore, and I think that's an enormous indictment on the banking industry today. And I think that has been well and truly shown in the report from the Royal Commission and the evidence that was provided to the Royal Commission through some nearly 10,000 submissions. But as has been touched on by a number of my colleagues in their previous contributions, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's important to reflect on what this government has been doing to ensure that the things that are occurring in the banking sector that we know are impacting on outcomes for consumers are being addressed sooner rather than later. And it's important to note even the Law Society of Australia came out the other day and made the point very importantly that we go through the proper process of ensuring that the legislation that we need to implement the recommendations is properly considered and properly done. But things are being done and have been done, Mr Deputy Speaker. We've created, I think importantly, AFCA, the one-stop shop for financial complaints, and it was touched on by the member for Herbert before about those that have unresolved issues with the banks. And we've made it clear that we've given AFCA the ability to go back 10 years, the time frame that the Royal Commission went back, to consider those claims by those who believe they've been wronged by the banks and have their cases heard. And I think that's critically important, Mr Deputy Speaker. The other important thing with AFCA is that it now has the ability to make binding decisions on the parties involved. We have also seen the removal of excess credit card charges, simplified calculation of credit interest, And importantly, I think the ban on unsolicited offers on credit card increases. But there are a range of other issues which I think are incredibly important, given the context that I painted before about a banking industry now populated by managers and professionals and no longer populated by bankers. And that is the banking executive accountability regime. The regime that seeks to ensure that we hold the executives of the banks accountable for the decisions they make. And far too often we have seen executives and senior officers of companies that have done the wrong thing escape sanction or punishment. We also know that the Royal Commissioner has made recommendations to ASIC on a range of matters, and I think it's incredibly important that we see those go through to fruition. Importantly too, to ensure that we have the proper standards in the financial advice sector. So we are taking action, Mr Deputy Speaker, and we will continue to do so.